Great. Can everyone hear me well? Yes. Okay. Perfect. Welcome all of you to our 10th meeting of the lecture series Young Prototypes, as we kind of get to the final part of the semester, the final stretch. Today we have our guests, 23 Calvin, joining us from Syracuse and Yale, and Ana, Nuno De Buen, joining from Delft in the Netherlands. So welcome to our guests. Before we kind of jump into the introductions, thank you to our guests, of course, for joining us, our students, colleagues, a lot of familiar faces today. So it feels like you know, a very kind of, yeah, familiar group. And the larger community, which is also kind of joining from Bozeman, Montana, where we are today. Please, you know, feel free to turn on your videos so we can feel, you know, each other's presence. And we will be recording this session, so please write to us through the chat if, you know, there's any problems with this. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to Young Prototypes, which is a lecture series hosted by Montana State University and curated by Frank Barkow, Laura Salazar, and myself, which addresses kind of the reciprocity between thinking and building, or building and thinking, through the voice of emerging practitioners. And more generally, we're also curious about how our peers approach the possibilities of architecture today. As we were saying, in today's session, we have another back-to-back lecture, which have been really, you know, incredibly productive and a lot of fun, with 23 Calvin and Ana Nuno De Buen. And after we hear from our lecturers, we will have an open session for discussion, which today is led by our student, Carolina Koniec. So everyone is welcome to participate. Just raise your hand, or, you know, simply unmute, or write your questions in the chat if you want. Now, I'll move forward to the introductions. So 23 Calvin, Marie Stargala and Matt Rosen are the co-directors of 23 Calvin, a Brooklyn-based practice that was founded in 2020 and has its roots in Basel, Switzerland, a couple of years prior to that. Through a kind of radical, simple approach to tectonics, material, texture, and with a strong conceptual ground across disciplines between crafts, arts, Marie and Matt create places and experiences working across scales, from buildings to interior to landscapes. You can enjoy, as we have, a conversation with them that will end up lasting hours, about construction details, and at the same time about amazing references and history and art and film and photography and models and materials, etc. This wide range of interests and fields of expertise informs, in our opinion, their incredibly sophisticated approach to design. In combination, Marie and Matt are also educators. Marie is currently teaching at Syracuse, and Matt is the assistant director of Yale Urban Design Workshop. Ana Nuno De Buen is a Mexican architect with an admirable portfolio of built work, also ranging in scales and context, and published widely in architecture media, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen. Currently, she's in Delft, the Netherlands, engaged in De Verlage, a school that is a reference in architecture discourse worldwide. We'd love to hear more about that. She has collaborated with the studios Nieto Sobejano in Berlin, as well as Nuno MacGregor De Buen and the studio MMX in Mexico City, leading various projects of different type and scale. She started her own practice in 2018, and in 2019, she received the Young Creators Grant given by the National Fund for Culture and Arts, FONCA, for her Space Between Pyramids project, which explores the pre-Hispanic architectural concepts present in the work of Joseph Alves, We also met Anna in Berlin some years ago, and we're intrigued by the way in which, as part of our generation, Anna is able to practice, study, and research across continents and contexts. So again, there seems to be a kind of productive intersection between, in this case, art and architecture that I am sure we will talk about today or tonight, and that resonates in the work of both practices. So please, let's welcome the first presentation, Maria and Matt. And without further ado, you can take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pablo. What an amazingly sweet introduction. I hope we can continue the conversations that we've had over many meals and drinks here. It's such a great context to do it. Here we go. Can everyone see this? Yeah, good. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about our practice today, not only in terms of the work, but also in terms of how we work and what we make and how we actually go about making. I think it's a great subject to tackle in a room full of architects, a virtual room full of architects, because we've all at some point sat down to try to make something. And I think we've all at some point come up against some difficulty in that process. And if not here, then where do we have those types of conversations? So again, thank you, Pablo and Laura and Frank, for providing the space for conversations like these to happen. So architecture is complicated. We all know this. There's so many things we need to consider. These are just a few of the ones that pop into mind for us when we start to list things that we care about in architecture. Things like efficiency or construction, like code, things like research or form or views or ecology or energy, or the specific culture that the project is in, or sound or craft or demographics. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And this is not even, this is a small percentage of what we could possibly list here. And with so many considerations, so many things to think about, it's almost dizzying. And then you start to think about how those all relate to each other and produce this insane web of kind of interrelations where the efficiency can affect the proportion, and the proportion affects the materiality, and the materiality affects the budget. And so everything kind of comes into relationship, and it gets very, very complicated. And so in our practice, we care deeply about these relationships. We think a lot about how these things interact, and we think that that level of consideration and care is crucial to the execution of good architecture and good design generally. But also we feel that methodologically, in terms of our process, it can be a little bit difficult to start making things when you have to consider all of these things all the time and how they all relate to each other. It's daunting. I mean, this diagram is scary in some ways. And so we wanted in our practice to rethink how we work, or to carve out space for ourselves to think through making and think through the practice of design outside of just through the projects which have to deal with these things, rightfully so. And the title of the lecture is kind of apt because we call this practice proto work. So I don't know, Pablo and Laura, it's kind of great, the relationship there. And we call it proto work, and the idea of proto not necessarily as the first step, although it has that relationship to being a precursor. It's really about a primitive for us. So this idea that it's not quite resolved, that it's about being in process. It's not ever complete. It's not ever defined necessarily. We don't have specific outcomes in mind. So we think about this type of practice. We think of it as a practice like, cooking or yoga or something, sort of something we do every day, which isn't contingent on a project or a client or a budget or a site, but it's just a way of life. It's a way of going through the world. And we do this across many mediums and many scales. So here is a table from our studio in Brooklyn, filled with these objects this is actually from a couple of years ago. It's no longer filled with these specifically, but you get the idea. We sort of make these things that are found materials. Some of them are more intentionally crafted. And some of them are, happenstance operations that we produce, and they don't really fall neatly into a category. I think that's the interesting thing. They're not necessarily disciplinary objects. Like there's no circulation path, there's no massing, there's no form necessarily. And they're also not really sculptures. They don't have that kind of rigor. They're a little more casual, I would say. And we like to create them. Also, sometimes they take the form of images or other types of practices. And so here, maybe we start thinking about how light and translucency and materiality and kind of textural backdrop, how these things start to produce a kind of cadence or a kind of sinewy texture. I mean, one day I might look at this image and think, oh, wow, what a great material to play with for some interior furnishing. And then the next day I might look at it as a circulation diagram for a building. The idea of it being reinterpretable is super important to us. And they don't really hold specific, as I say, a specific value. They just have an aesthetic quality that we find attractive or like kind of tacky. There's this way that we talk about it almost tactily, that we have this like affinity towards these things. And sometimes we find them in the world and we frame them and we kind of grab them from outside of our studio and use them or not, or they just sort of sit there. But we can read all kinds of ideas into these objects, things like the glossiness or the reflectivity or the crunchiness of a material that might have digital or certain material or formal relationships that we otherwise wouldn't have produced in a project, right? So the idea of being open or finding these things in the world is part of what it means to be thinking through this practice of proto work. Also, they can happen really casually. This one I love that Marie made on her phone on a train, sketching on her phone. And I think that there's so much beauty in the texturing that certain tools can produce, and we find the tool in the same way that we find the result, we find the object. So certain tools can produce certain outcomes, and it's always fun to pick up a new tool and mess around with it and see what you just make intuitively. And this is kind of fitting within that practice. You can also think about ways of mistakes or flukes or found kind of happy accidents and actually capturing those and saving those and treating them as precious and not just discarding them because they weren't what you first intended, but actually the mistake becomes the most important thing, or this mistake is emergent, even if it's not applicable in the context of the work that you were doing. In that moment, it's maybe applicable later. And so there's this sense of maybe hoarding or saving that comes out of that practice as well. Again, thinking through different relationships that might be symbolic. So here, this was actually in consideration of an elevation, though they're extremely abstract and kind of loose. The looseness is maybe the most important part here, where we can start to misread or reread the intention of the drawing in many ways. Same thing here. And then we sort of come back out into different materials. We put them in relationship, like even in this way, the casting at the top of your screen and the metal plates at the bottom of the screen weren't really intended to be in this specific relationship when they were constructed, but the specific relationship and the way it's framed in the image produce something that is interesting to us. And it's interesting in a way that's importantly maybe undefinable. Is my audio okay? I'm hearing you. It's good. Okay, good. Sorry. Yeah. So it's formative in that way, that these little happy accidents like Bob Ross would do. This is from a hike we took recently in this frozen lake, and the way the glass shattered, and then the way we sort of tilted the camera to produce this outcome really reminded a lot about these drawings from like the late 90s, like sort of OMA, like having a relationship to certain axonometric drawings or traditions within architecture. This is a really like fascinating thing that started to emerge where, is it garbled, Pablo?
Maybe there's like
Strange feedback.
yeah. Maybe Maria needs to
How is this
Let's try now.
better? Good? Yes, okay, cool. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Yeah, these are these pieces of packing tape that we started to draw with, and the transparency and the stickiness of the tape itself like produces these imperfections. They don't lay flat really. They produce this kind of bubbling, which compositionally is pretty amazing. So, you know, it can feel sort of dumb in a way to venerate packing tape, or to treat these things in this with the same reverence that you might do a hand drawing that you spent 100 hours doing, or rendering or whatever, a model. But in a way, they're no less important to us. And I think that that's true just with me and Marie, like walking around, we'll kind of freak out about, you know, a random piece of trash on the sidewalk and photograph it like crazy people. And this is like, I think, indicative of a way of being in the world that you find, if you are open to finding these opportunities, they kind of exist everywhere. And if you make with that perspective, you find things emerging. Like there's so much around you that, of course, there's so much in the field of architecture and in art and in film and all of these things, but there's also so much in packing tape. So here's a good example of a thing like that. I mean, this massing is pretty fantastic. It's refrigerators in Brooklyn on the sidewalk, and I mean, it stopped us in our tracks. We were on our way to get a coffee, and it was just amazing. But then also we make things more intentionally, right? So, you know, we have a series of materials sort of always around, where we start to just stack or combine or cast or do these things. So, you know, we're on the phone with somebody and we're, you know, talking, and we start to just play with things. Like, I think playfulness is super important, and keeping that energy alive day to day for us. I mean, I think students might not have this feeling yet, but maybe the professionals in the room might attest to this, that the many requirements of life, the kind of logistical necessity of practice, can feel a little overburdensome, like it can feel crushing, and that joy of play can get lost very quickly and very easily. And so for us, we really don't ever want to let that go, and we push to make that part of our lives. And so all of these have that quality in some way. But thinking about the relationship, like for instance here, between reflection, linearity, and verticality, right? Like, what does it mean to think of this as a massing for a building, or think of this as a certain ground condition, or the continuity of material and the difference of finishing, right? Like the matte quality of these pieces of aluminum versus the more reflective quality of the base here, and how that actually interacts. So, you know, you can think of this object at the scale of a detail. Say it's a hand, like a door pull. You can also think of it at the scale of a building. And that slipperiness is just fantastic. And thinking about things, we find this little stone that Marie put on top of this piece, which was really exciting the other day. And then this is the one I sort of made in response, integrating these sticks with these pieces of aluminum. Here we're thinking a little bit about massing versus planar elements. So thinness versus thickness would be the axiom that we would typically think about. But within that thickness and thinness, there's an implied material change, and the structural capacity of that material, and therefore the aesthetic property of that material emerges. And then also sort of the experiential aspects of these objects that have correlations to buildings and spaces. The idea that, you know, at a certain time of day, the light might hit an object in a certain way that lights it up, literally, that like illuminates it. And that keeping those realities in mind, those framings or those reflections in mind as we design is super important. Here's an object, a sewn object, playing around with translucency, also potentially proportion and cadence. These beautiful tracks here in this is inside of a salt shed. So this is a building in Syracuse that they use to hold salt that they put on the roads. I'm sure you guys might have similar things in Montana. And the tracks that are made in relationship to the massing of the salt just naturally forming. And the tones and the colors and the forms of other found conditions. I think this is at an airport somewhere. Versus the thinness and the intentionality of like delicate, precisely made, crafted objects. And then again, like, what does it mean to produce something which implies space or produces material outcomes, but doesn't have sort of strictly architectural capacity? And how does that relate to flattening or three-dimensionality or light or atmosphere? What is this space? How does this space make us feel? Is this a feeling that is applicable to a project? Like the capturing of this moment really only exists through the photographic like capacity of the work, but it also might be something we can then deploy in a certain space for a certain project later. Same here. And here. And then, you know, playing around with these different types of objects, these stones here, which imply a space. So thinking about, you know, spatial space making as not framing or as not boundary making, but also as implication through a more gentle practice of just leaving openness and letting that openness form itself into a space. And then the proto work practice brings itself maybe more also from the material, which is something we really love to do. We love to work physically, also through drawing, but also into more digital tools. So working through tools that we use all the time to produce similarly situated objects, which are emergent and non-specific, but also can be read in multiple ways. Some of them are a little bit more targeted, I would say, than the material objects, which can be a little bit more broad, but they fall on that continuum of non-specific, non-sighted objects. Here, a kind of tower massing and a reverse stepping and another sort of tower, letting our minds kind of go away and see what comes. And this process of working, it's really powerful because we don't really know what it'll be until it's done or until we're done working on it, because it's never really done. But unlike a project that we're going to show you in a moment, where there's a program and we know what that program is before we even start doing anything, here we don't know what it is. Like I didn't, when I started making this, I didn't know if it would be a horizontal building or a vertical building. I didn't know what it would sort of emerge to be. And I think that process of real unknowing, like truly, I don't know what this is going to be, is a really powerful one, because it starts to reflect back at you the things that are lying around in your subconscious or the back of your mind. Looking at these now, every time I look at these images, I think a different thought than I did the last time I saw it, or even when I made it. I think, you know, I see it differently and I see different potentials in it. And I think that there's a real power to those types of practices. So to sort of end on this, we're going to now transition into talking more about our builds or our practice, which is building buildings. This is a sort of sub practice within that we engage in on a daily basis, as I said. And I would invite you all to try to make some proto work, just mess around for the fun of it and see what happens. Our emails are online, and if you want to send them to us, we'd love to see them. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marie.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Just want to make sure. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So we want to sort of dive into one of our projects that, like Matt said, is more part of our architecture practice and not so much part of the proto work. And this project is a residence in Amagansett, New York. It exists right next to a national park. So here you have Long Island, you see Manhattan to the lower left, and Brooklyn. And the site is about an hour and a half, maybe 2-hour drive from New York City. And so this project, can you zoom in, Matt? Or
yeah.
Next? Matt's doing the presentation, so
Yeah.
yeah. So this 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 project, like I said, is on Long Island, which is a very interesting condition because it's a landscape that is extremely flat. And it is in a location that's prone to hurricanes. So that means whenever there is a hurricane, this island can flood immensely. Can you go to the next image? And so there used to be, for example, this existing, or there was a fishing village in the location where we're building this residence. And this village was actually completely flooded at one point. I think it was about 100 years ago. And so they're predicting that about every 100 years, this area will flood. So here's some images of what that area used to have. It was a very industrial sort of fishing village. And this flood actually, I think it put the whole sort of northern end of Long Island underwater. The water rose about 8 feet. And the site that we're working on is about 3 feet. So that means it would be 5 feet underwater. And this is what it looked like in, like I said, I think it was the 1920s or so. And so that means, knowing this as the sort of historical base for the project, right? There's now these regulations that have been put in place that really deal with this idea of flooding. And so FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they have set certain building codes in place. One of them being that you have to build 10 feet above the sea level in that area. And so that means that the first story of the residence has to be actually on the second floor. Here you have the site zooming in. You have in white here, you have the actual site, which is quite small. It actually has an old fishing house on it that was renovated, but that the clients have decided to demolish and sort of start from scratch. So can you go to the next one? Yes, so here you have some of the main idea, which is that we wanted to touch down or sort of have the building land on these 4 massive blocks. And they house, staircases, storage, all kinds of things. And the idea is that you could actually move between these blocks. And then, like I said, the residence would be above. So here you see it's very small, sort of 1-bedroom house with a main living area, which is quite large. And then you have a sort of flex space in between and a balcony that surrounds the whole building. Could you go to the next one? So here you have a roof plan. Could you go to the next? Next. So this section is really what drove the project, though. There's this building code law, which is called the Pyramid Law, which exists on this property, which means that you can't build above this 45-degree angle on either side of the property. And this is really meant to prevent neighbors from building too close to one another. But because the site is already so constrained, it really drove the design for this project. So here is an elevation of the building. And here you see already these sort of piers, these blocks that we're placing the residents on. Can you go to the next one? And the next one. Yeah, so this is just flipping through a couple of the sections. So you get a feel for how constrained we were really by that pyramid. And then in the long section, you also see that pyramid law on either end, which also drove sort of the size of the project, along with, of course, the percentage of the building that you could take up of the lot. So here it is. It really was, for us, meant to feel like almost like a boat that was floating or being held up by these main piers. And the materiality was also driven by this building code that only allowed us to build within a certain percentage of the property, meaning that the mesh actually allows water to flow through in certain areas like the walkway and the porch in the front. So the building actually, the interior space only occupies a certain percentage of the lot. Here you have that walkway moving past all the interior spaces, and this walkway goes all the way around the entire residence. Can we go to the next one? And so here it is from the front. And again, the idea was, of course, to lift it, but also to make that experience, you know, worthwhile, not just to lift it and have that be crawl space, but to have that actually be the main entrance, the main circulation path. And so, you know, I think looking back at the proto work, you know, there's never a direct correlation between the work that we do that's more experimental and the actual architecture that we propose. But there is, you know, of course, a link there because we are the same designers that made both those objects and the architecture, but we try to have them be separate in a way so that we don't feel like the objects have to work, let's say, with the building code or work with certain parameters, but so those objects can actually stay free. And I would, in a way, say that the proto work is a library of references that we create for ourselves, which we can always draw from. And I think that is something that is very useful, especially in an age where, you know, we all use Instagram, social media, and so there's a lot of references that we're constantly put in contact with. And I think it's important to not just respond to those references that other people have made, but to respond to the references that you make and that are maybe more intuitive, that you could almost call an art practice or something else that is not fully architectural, that has the capacity to become architecture. And so with that, I think we can move on to Anna's lecture, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That was great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
And do you see my presentation on full screen?
Not yet. We can see it, but not full screen.
And now? No?
Yeah, we can see it.
In full screen, okay. First of all, thank you very much, Laura and Pablo and Frank Barkow for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and be able to share my work with you guys and also see some familiar faces on the Zoom. Yeah, and be part of this amazing series of lectures that you made. So my presentation is called Thoughts on Process, and I'll go through 3 different projects that I guess touch upon the topic of process in different ways. So the first one is called Space Between Pyramids. Pablo mentioned already some things, but in the great introduction that he made. This project is a bit different from the other ones that I'll show, but I think that yeah, shows a bit of my way of working. So to give you some context, this was made part of a grant that's given by the Mexican government. And I think what's important about that is that it's a 1-year-long project. So I had time to develop it, and I mean, I was doing other things at the time, but I kept going back to it all throughout 1 year. So the starting point of the project is the visual work of German artist Josef Albers and its relationship to pre-Columbian architecture. So for those who don't know them, Josef and Annie Albers, I think we can say that they're 2 of the most influential artists of the 20th century. Him being a painter or graphic artist, and her mainly focusing on textiles. They were teaching at the Bauhaus, and they had to leave Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power. And they went to the US because they were invited by the Black Mountain College in North Carolina to teach there. After 2 years of being there, they made their first trip to Mexico at the end of 1935. And they were completely amazed by the country and pre-Hispanic art and culture, specifically the formal abstraction present in architecture, sculpture, ceramics, textiles, like any art form. And that was also like in total reference with their own artistic searches. The name of the project comes from this, well, this is an excerpt of a letter that Joseph Albers sent to a close friend. And yeah, he's talking about how like the fascination they have by going to Monte Albán. So in 32 years, they did 13 trips to the country. Some of them lasted weeks, some other months. They would use Mexico City as a starting or like as a base, and they would travel to mainly different archaeological sites along the different regions of the country. And I think something important to mention is that they were not just using these trips as inspiration. They would also produce their own work in Mexico. So this series of photo montages, I don't know, maybe some of you already know them. These are made by Joseph Albers, not necessarily as an end work, but mostly as part of his process, work process for the paintings that he would do later. So in particular, in Joseph Albers' paintings, you can see like the influence of Mexican architecture in them. In a way, there is like this spatiality present in them, that they could even be architectonic representations in plan section or axonometrical representations, perspective representations. And so the project that I was proposing, or that I proposed and ended up doing, was to continue this story. So following what Albers did, which was drawing inspiration from architecture to do painting, the project proposed use his painting to go back to architecture again. So I divided in two parts. There's an initial research part, and then the creative project, which consisted of making a series of conceptual models that would, transpose the two-dimensional space present in Joseph Albers' paintings, graphic work, and take it to a three-dimensional architectonic space. When I started working on it, I started to feel very frustrated, because I was thinking the two parts, the research and the creative project, as two separate things. Waiting to have the research done so I could jump in on the creative project. And I felt at some point at the beginning, after this frustration, that I needed to actually combine both things and understand research also as a subjective process, and make it part of the creative process as well. So I started working on I call it a personal archive, that in a way helped me visualize the research that I was doing, which otherwise I would be like writing in a notebook and not have like visually present like all the time, and also be able to visualize the process. So through drawing, sketching, writing, collage, I appropriate the research material that I kept finding, which is like texts, images, essays written by Albers or by other people about him or his work, the actual work. And then I would add like thoughts and ideas that I was having about the models that I was going to make. So through this, I kept using this tracing paper, then in a way allowed me to work with different layers of information. And it was in a way like an additive exercise, in the sense that I would never feel like this archive was complete. I would always go back to previous previous parts of it and continue working on them and add things that I kept finding interesting. So let's say the unit of this archive is where the A3 papers. They are organized by topic. And as I said before, like they follow like a free and non-linear process. And what happened with this archive is that it actually became part of the outcome of the project, part of one of the exhibition pieces that I made. I also like that they relates in a way to Albert's photographic montages. So I found like interesting the connection there. And I think what was like super interesting or something I really liked about doing this is that in a way the whole process was directing in a way made up the result. No, I did not know that I was going to end up having this. So the process actually shaped the final result. So next to the archive, I made these five models that each model in a way reflects different spatial search present in Albert's work. I did a sort of analysis of the work and established different groups and series. He would work a lot with series and seriality. And I tried to identify the pre-Columbian architecture concepts that were present in it. So it could be there a geometric abstraction, interaction between light and shadow sequence, superposition of planes, visual frames, tectonics, many things. And started doing these spatial explorations that I worked with them through like 3D models, but also use these working models as such. They would all follow, well, they were scaled 1 to 50, and they would all follow like a 1 meter grid, so that I could think about them as like successive spaces that would add and complement each other. I was also very interested in thinking of how these models could be linked one to the other, and how this space, which was a very fluid space between interior and exterior, could be multi-directional and could be read diagonally and traversed in many directions. Another thing that I found out while doing this exploration is that the photographic record of these models in a way transported them back to 2 dimensions, this 3D spatiality back 2 dimensions. And well, this is the outcome was presented in an exhibition, and I think this project allowed me to understand the capacity of interdisciplinary research to open or produce new perspectives of knowledge. Yes. Then moving to architecture, this project is called Núcleo, which is an ephemeral pavilion that I did in collaboration with Luis Young and Flores Cosmos, which are floral designers, for Fija, which is a flowers and gardens festival, and it lasts a weekend, and it's done in Mexico City, in a central neighborhood called Polanco. Different to the first project that I showed you, this was a very quick process. It was a very short process with minimum design, installation, dismantling times, as well as lifespan of the pavilion, which was just 3 days. So the initial presentation of the projects to the directors of the festival happened really like from one day to the other. We had to come up with an idea super quickly and present it to them. It's almost like a drawing on a napkin type of cliche, but it happened like that. This is like a tiny booklet that we made with drawings that were made in a couple of hours that tried to communicate the idea. The idea of the project was to locate it in a reflecting pool that exists inside a park in that neighborhood where the flower festival happens, and make these two concentrical cycles covered in flowers that would have different heights and would lead you to this central space. It was like a play on forms, colors, and reflections. And we somehow managed to convince them to do it, and were assigned a very small budget to do it. So the site of the project, I guess you can see my cursor. Can you?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. The site of the project was on this reflecting pool, specifically on this side of the park, of the pool. We were like super happy because it was like recently renovated. It was actually empty, so we could build everything being like dry, and then it would be filled up for perfect timing for the inauguration of the pavilion. We started building it on a Wednesday afternoon, I guess. Yes, and the idea was to have the structure built by that night so that they could put cover it with the flowers the next morning, and it would be ready for the inauguration. We were doing these platforms made out of brick that were like stuck together without mortar. We got this brick company lend them to us. The idea was that they could then reuse them for other purposes. And we used a scaffolding structure that was of course rented, and it's very quick to install and dismantle. That would be then covered by mesh and the flowers. So everything was going smoothly, and until at one point of the evening, there was a neighbor that was walking her dog, and she saw it and took a picture, posted it on Twitter, and mentioned the mayor of that part of that neighborhood. I don't know if you can call him mayor, but saying that it was, how could it be that they had just renovated the floor and that we were damaging it with the structure that we was putting on top of it. So the pavilion was canceled, and just from 1 second to the other, because it was like this huge thing on Twitter. And somehow the directors managed to, well, talk to them, and they gave us a new site for the pavilion, which is here. So in a different area, I mean, still nice, but it didn't have the water. And so we had to come up with an idea super quick to modify the pavilion to its new site. Many things of the previous one did not make sense. Of course, it had to be smaller also and simpler, because we had lost so many hours by building the previous one, and we had to do it quickly as well, because the workers were there, they were being paid, and they had to, I mean, we needed their time. So it was like a, I don't know, 10-minute sketch, and we started doing the construction that same night. These are pictures on the day after it, so that it could be inaugurated at the same time. We had to work on the drawings overnight, so we could give the instructions to the people putting the bricks, the scaffolding, the flowers. And well, I guess at the end it was like a quite successful pavilion. what I want to tell you with all these stories that sometimes there are like things that you cannot, that you can't control, and that you have to like be quick and think of solutions. I guess the effect or the spatial intention, the idea of having like a very abstract object in the middle of the park with no actual hint from the outside of what was happening on the inside worked quite well. You would enter through this threshold or passage that was covered, and then that would lead to this nice interior space, which the floral designers worked on it a lot. The idea was like to create a new ecosystem, like an invented ecosystem that you would not expect from the outside. And you have like the colors and the smells and the forms and the everything, the flowers, which made it yeah, quite nice. We ended up doing this bench with the brick, and I guess the color of the brick played a nice contrast with the green of the inside. And I think what relates to, I was thinking something that relates to what Matt was saying on the first part of the lecture. I think I see there's two sides of, at least how I see it, there's two sides of a design process that run in parallel. In a way, one of them is like an analytical process, and the other one can be more intuitive. And both of these processes like have a starting point, questions that you make yourself. On the analytical part could be like, well, what are the prompts of the project? What does the client need? What is the program? What is the site and the physical context and the historical context? And then on the intuitive side, I think the questions are different type of questions you pose yourself are different. It's like they're more personal in a way, but like, what do I as a designer want to do? Like, which spatial, formal, programmatic intentions do I have or want to explore? What is the spatial experience that I want to achieve? And probably like intuition is a tricky word, because you could think that it's something that's given, but I guess I do believe that it's something that you can learn and that you actually need to constantly practice. And I think a way to do it is like by active observation, and that's where I related to what Matt was saying. Like to pay attention to what you're seeing. Me personally, a way to do that is through drawing. It is the way I like actively observe, the moment I can take time to look at what I'm drawing and seeing it and understanding proportions, and also, for example, by measuring space. So whenever I find myself in a place that just feels right and feels like it has the right scale, that I would not normally measure it, like either by walking by steps or by counting the tiles, in order to get an idea of the scale and what I like about the place that I'm in. And I guess those things that you're like actively observing and registering become part of this mental library that you were also talking about. And it's then knowledge that you intuitively use for other projects. So these are some drawings that I do. I normally tend to have a notebook with me and register those things. Yeah, so that, and I can use it for different projects. Yeah, intuitively, no, in quotes. So the third project that I'm presenting it's called Cascada House. Cascada is the name of the street in this neighborhood on the southern part of Mexico City. which is called Pedregal de San Ángel. It was a neighborhood that was actually developed by Barragán and has like the interesting characteristic of being on a volcanic stone. It is how it developed is mainly quite large houses with large gardens, and the project was an addition to an existing house in this neighborhood. It was a 1950s one-story house, which with horizontal concrete slabs. Well, actually, from the side of the garden, you do have 2 stories, but this was actually an addition. The original volume was just the upper part, and you would have like the terrain go underneath it. And the thing with this house is that this neighbor over here, built like a massive wall that blocked the entrance of the sun of this house, and that made it way darker than it was before, and that also like worsened the humidity problems this house had. So the client's solution was to build himself something located on the rooftop of the house. So in a way, abandon the bottom part and then move upstairs. I mean, for us, it worked perfectly because it was like an unused space with really amazing conditions. Having the height of the tree canopies of the garden and also of the neighboring gardens like that up close, made it like super interesting. I mean, not that we agree with the decision of just ignoring the main problem, which was like actually the house and the actual conditions of the house. And I guess we could not forget about these references that we used. These are all houses, or well, the one on the left is more like a pavilion, which are located in this neighborhood, and that they were like following the international style, of course, but they would place themselves, or they would just land on the terrain, and then the terrain would go underneath it. So yeah, like we were always thinking of doing something like a light structure that would in a way like pose itself on top of the existing one. These are some diagrams to explain how it was in terms of orientation, the neighbors, the views, and how we divided the program. So on this side, which is the northern part, was like more the private program, and on the other part, the public part of the house. We would close the house to both of the neighbors, well, to the neighbors actually, and have this, let's say, condition, yeah, that would traverse the house. And that would connect the garden and also the garden from the neighbors as free. And these are, well, some sketches. As I was saying before, like I really like to keep notebooks, and in a way, sketching is a way to record the ideas I'm having, and also a way to try to communicate them. This in particular talk about the development of the steel structure of the house. What we did was, or what we wanted to do was actually separate the project like formally, and also some materials as well from the existing house, and make something that would be completely different. It had to be, you had to read it as something else. So this is the floor plan. This is the connection to the actual house is on the inside of the existing house. You go up this staircase and get to the public part of the house. This is the division that I was telling you before. This side is more the private. This is the main bedroom. This part can actually be closed and be turned into a second bedroom with a wall here. And this, well, now that it's open, you have this continuity, spatial continuity that we really wanted. But the main, I guess, the main feature of the house is that you actually can open up the whole house to the surroundings and to the exterior, and the interior and exterior are totally blended together. No? Also a way to structure the program was to use these two sloped roofs and have the water drainage as a canal here in the middle, and that would also be, if you go back to the floor plan, it would also mean you have services there, so the closet and the kitchen, and this could be, well, would be the eventual second closet of the second bedroom. This was all steel structure. We had to reinforce the concrete beams, which had almost no steel at all. Of course, we made sure that the existing house could actually support this amount of weight, but in a way, of course, the idea of making it a steel structure was to have the least amount of weight, extra weight on it. The house works as a system, so the structure, constructive system, spatial organization, materiality, following a way quite rigorous and logical order. It is somehow approached as a game, the structure, no? So like every element would, well, it fits in the other one. The columns have the beams or trusses that in a way hug it on the different sides. You have the vertical elements that enter the three horizontal, you have them double, so enter the three horizontal levels, horizontal elements. And that was like quite fun to develop it. It was also a project that we worked a lot on the construction side, so many of the detailings, we would make quick drawings that would then be, we would give them to the contractor, and he would work with them, so that it was quite a dynamic process, and that made it lots of fun as well. Yeah, so yes, these are the main spaces of the house, and how the connection between interior and exterior is achieved. Yeah, it was one of the most important things that we wanted to get. No? Yes, now I'm currently working on a different project. I just want to show this quickly, because in a way it's a continuation of Cascada House in a different area of the city, but with a similar context. So mainly two-story houses, individual houses, and I guess it could be something to be replicated. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mexico City, but it's quite a horizontal city. So apart from certain areas in the city center that you do have apartment buildings or office buildings, it's very horizontal. So this could be like a strategy of densifying these areas of the city without actually taking any more land. And yes, I think, yeah, this is the last one. So done.
Thank you.
Hello. It's okay. Hi, my name is Karolina Konieczna. Anna, Matt, and Maria, I see that three of you really take your time to look at your surroundings, and you really pay attention what you see. I will start with Anna. The work what you have done demonstrates an interest in exploring the relationship between research, information, and art creativity, as well creating immersive and transformative, beautiful spaces for humans and for public. Your thoughts and process, what you had presented, gives a very deep, is generally very deep, has incredible different layers of information shaping. You're as well, as I saw, flexible. You come up with the idea of a pavilion in one day and adjusting the house for the better of the life of the humans, what is extremely incredible. Maria and Matt, you are a very accomplished and talented architects, designers, and artists. You have a strong commitment to your craft and exploration of the materials and new ideas. Your expertise enters across various aspects of the design I saw from your website, from architecture, interior design, and landscape design. I love your love to texture, shapes, and forms. You see their power and potentials. You can make an object to have emotions and create art out of it. Like, for example, the stick and a rock. Like, it's so beautiful itself. So I will start with Maria and Matt. I have a question about something maybe simple. Did you ever had a texture or like a material you had reframed that happened later on, like a pleasant surprise in your project?
Maria, do you want to comment on this?
I guess, could you rephrase that question? I just want to make sure I get it right.
Yes. Do you have ever create use a material what you had later on, like kind of reframe it to fix to your to fit in your project, and you were just experimenting, for example, and it came something like a happy mistake, or just like you did not know that it can. You did not expect such a happy outcome out of it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good question. I think actually most of the work that Matt was showing, the PROTO work, is in a way like a happy accident. Like, I think that the way that Matt phrased it is that it is a practice, and so, you know, it's kind of like the way that a musician might just like try out random things, and then one day it's like, oh, thank God I practiced because I landed on this one chord that's just incredible. And I think that's kind of how I feel about what we make, is that we make a lot of stuff, and then we, you know, some of it we're really excited about, and some of it we don't even photograph. That's never even like recorded. And so I guess you could call a lot of the work like, I don't know if I would consider it a happy accident, because it is, I don't know, it is in a way the fact that we curate it in the end, that it becomes extremely intentional, right? The fact that we know which object we want to photograph or which thing it is that is important to us, I think that is what makes it intentional, even if the process in a way was like more intuitive or happy accident like.
Yeah, I would also add that the accidental nature of the production of the work is very quickly flattened by the conversation that ensues thereafter, where either Maria or I share the thing with each other. And I think that there's this dialogue that happens in a practice of two, where, you know, I might do something and think it's really cool, and then Maria might come along and be like, I don't know, maybe. And then, you know, vice versa, or we might feed off each other's energy. I might do something that I think is not very cool, and Maria might look from across the room and be like, that's really sick, like you should do that. You should build on that, build on that. And I think it happens both ways. So the happy accident quality of the work is not only internal, but it's also through collaboration, right? Like there's the circumstance that the work provides to collaborate and to kind of come together around a shared perspective. I think that is really maybe where the accident or the chance of it happens, or the that type of operation emerges.
Thank you. I see that Matt has his hand up. Matt?
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So I had a question that kind of got brought up during Matt and Marie's presentation, and kind of just this idea of like thinking constantly about interpretation, kind of both in the objects and in the painting and Anna's presentation. And I see it as like this way to like allow for play, which kind of frees our mind to create like these divergent decisions and thus create responses of great architecture. But I don't think it's necessarily like limited to that. So it's kind of a question for both parties here. So like how do you guys see and like use this kind of divergent thinking in other walks of life? And how does that then again influence your architecture?
I don't know, Anna, do you want to speak about that with the relationship to your research, maybe, or the early research you showed? I feel like that's pretty much the answer.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in a way that the separation, if we talk about art or different artistic disciplines that we're taught, it exists, for example, between architecture and painting, or between other types of art forms, is not actually like that, and should not be like that. In a way, we all follow similar, or like any creative process has many similarities, and when whatever a writer encounters when he's about to write, is quite similar to what we encounter when we're starting a project. So I guess we can draw many similarities between those processes, and like reading about how other people or artistic creators tackle this idea of a new project. I think it helps a lot, and it's like information that you can use and transpose to your own discipline. Yes.
I mean, I might add that the reflexive quality of making work, right? So the idea of doing something, looking at it, like critiquing it and redoing it or progressing it, that's a process that is very productive in all kinds of domains outside of just architectural practice, right? So a lot of us, or at least most of us here who aren't students, are teaching as well, and that isn't architecture, but I think architectural education benefits from the discipline of architecture, in that there's this kind of there's this attitude towards thinking through traditional things, right, to inheriting systems that have worked for a long time, and then evolving them, analyzing them, critiquing them, rethinking them, and experimenting through them. So maybe that is the kind of architectural thinking which is not architectural, or not strictly in that practice, that I think we engage in.
Speaking of it, I'm curious, how important do you consider the role of local culture, traditions, and context in shaping your architecture designs? I kind of follow you on all over the place, and I notice amazing stuff. And Anna?
Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
So the question is, can you repeat it? Sorry.
Yeah, how important do you consider the role of local culture, traditions, and context in shaping your architecture ideas and design?
Yes. Well, I think it's super important to understand the context, and well, of course, not just the physical context, the historical context as well, and understand what happened in that site before. Well, not necessarily just in that site, but as also in part of that culture. I think all of that is like input you get and information that can feed your design. It is tricky, I guess, or like or interesting to think about in terms of, and I'm sure this won't answer your question necessarily, but will maybe raise other questions, but how you can actually practice like locally in a globalized world, or in a place where you can actually be in another country and practice and do a project on completely in the opposite side of the world. And yes, I think I'm just confusing things. I'm not sure if I'm answering any question. But yeah, I mean, I've had those thoughts. I'm always trying to incorporate the local aspects, the site and the historical part in my projects. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone has like any more questions and wants to like right now say?
Laura has her hand up.
Thanks. So okay, there's so many things. First of all, thank you guys so much for the presentations of your work. It's of course Pablo and I are familiar with it, but it's completely another thing to hear you guys speak about it. And you know, every word you use is somehow so precise for both of you, and somehow so insightful to the extent that it feels like you are pulling on this thread of a thought that's already in my head, and learning how to kind of articulate it in this way that I didn't even expect. But it's wonderful that you know that there's can be this kind of synchronicity, like I think kind of as a cross-generational, like as a transversal set of interests and concerns. And I love what Anna was saying at the end of her response about working globally, but somehow always responding to something local, or to respond to the kind of situational observations that you could have on a daily basis. And I want us to definitely talk about that. And I'm going to put that onto Pablo. But I had a question that is kind of coming from earlier in the discussion, which has to do with this idea of iteration, and to kind of be constantly producing an archive as a chest from which to draw ideas or test concepts, which I think is such an important way to work, because it's a discipline in and of itself, that we are trying to you know, convey to our students as well, you know, kind of a way of working as the production of a discipline that you decide on, you know, as a kind of process, a way to develop your own kind of value system, and answer your own questions, so to speak, when it comes to design. And I guess one thing that came up in a previous talk, which has become a kind of recurrent theme, is the idea that, you know, we in our kind of contemporary condition produce these things, you know, as kind of miniatures, or as iterations through objects, through images, through we reach out towards the transdisciplinary because our opportunities to iterate through architecture are limited, perhaps at this point in our careers, but perhaps it's also, has to do with a broader set of issues that have to do with our current kind of socio-political economic scenario. Like, I think, the architects of the 20th century or before would somehow iterate through ideas in built work, because you would be doing, I don't know, like 30 projects a year or something, right? And I mean, I don't know if that's an exaggeration, but it seems like it's a kind of, there's one modality of practice, which is I'm going to, work through stone in a particular way for the next 5 projects and have that as a kind of mode of research. And somehow we've separated that kind of research from the actual building because of issues of access and economy and so on. And I think that we're all trying to kind of bridge back to it somehow. And so where's my question? I guess it has to do with, whether you think that that is something that you would try to, as your career advances, how do you think that kind of starts to play into working through, the actual construction process of buildings? Either of you is cool.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point. I think Matt and I are always, we're very much interested in buildings, but we, of course, it's like you said, it's difficult to always land the projects that you want to have. So it is true that a lot of the work that we do is in a way to substitute the opportunities that we do or don't get. And so, yeah, but I think I am interested in seeing like how our practice evolves and how that changes the way that we think about our work as well. Like right now, I think a lot of the proto work, is thinking about sort of the initial phases, meaning like massing or, the sort of conceptual end of things. But I could imagine that the more we build, maybe the proto work is really a bunch of details that we build, or who knows what, maybe more construction related. Yeah. And I also think that, I think there's an interesting way in which the proto work or what we call proto work is somehow separate from, let's say, iterations of a design. Meaning like for this project in Emigenset, we came up with a lot of different proposals, right, throughout. But we don't really call those proto work. Instead, the proto work is sort of separate from this iteration building. Yeah. And I think the iterations are in a way also a separate archive that we're not really showing right now. And I think, this archive of iterations plus the proto work, I think, that I think is an interesting library there. And I think that the library of built work, I think in relation to that will also be interesting. So there's like the proto work library, the iterations library, and then the built work library. And I can't wait to see how the built work library or built work archive will influence, future work. I think that that you see that in other architects' careers, right? The built work is like this thing that is iterated upon, and then eventually a certain style or something evolves out of that. And I think that is where it really becomes interesting. I think what we're doing right now is like sort of very the initial stages of what I hope will become more an archive of build work. Yeah.
I mean, I would say the proto work specifically stands a little bit outside of the dynamic that you illustrated, Laura. I think that there's what you said is totally true, that there's a bottleneck there between what you might, like as a young architect might want to explore quickly. You have a lot of energy. You're not like a 75-year-old person who's, late career and has 30 projects a year. But I think that the proto work, because of the scale of it, and potentially because of the, as I was saying, the difference of tools or mediums or materials, it sort of pushes back on you in a way that's different than architecture because of the time scale of it, because of the implications of it. I think there's something really productive in the reciprocal process of making and understanding, right? So when you make something and you look at it and you actually critique it or analyze it, you actually learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about your interests and what you like. You make something, you're like, why did I make that thing? Like maybe it had to do with something else connected to my past or my present, or why is it this thing emerging in this way, or why do I keep on making these same gestures over and over again? You begin to be able to self-critique and self-analyze, and there's something really productive about that I don't think you could ever do at the scale of a building, because it's not so personal. It can't be so personal. It's really for someone else. Like the proto work, we see it as being for us, like we're the client in a way. And the buildings, we really think a lot about the person we're making it for. Like it's a gesture for others. And it's that difference is important, I think.
Yes, I agree. In a way, what you're saying is what you developing on through the proto works is building this your language, no, and that can then be reflected on your build work. I guess I see it similarly as well. There's also one aspect which relates to what you were saying, Laura, that not having like maybe the amount of opportunities that the previous generation had to do things, that can also be quite paralyzing. That whenever you have one opportunity, you want to make it right. And you also start doubting a lot, and maybe you think, okay, what if this is the last thing that I'll do? No, and it can be quite paralyzing. Yeah, because it's about trying to not think about it that way, of course. But I guess it's something, it's like a ghost up there that you can't ignore, and that it's interesting.
I think that in a way has also an influence on the work itself. Like I could imagine a painter who only has one canvas to paint on, whereas another painter who has like 10 canvases and they can kind of like mess up on one and then like try another. I feel like when you only have one, it definitely makes you more careful, which definitely I think has an influence on the architecture that you produce, like the actual form and the actual, thing that you produce might feel more careful, which is pretty interesting. I think that might have an effect on work.
Well, to follow that analogy, I mean, I don't know, if you were a painter, you would do oils, and then you could kind of make a palimpsest on the same painting forever, as long as it dries. I wonder if there's a kind of way to think about oils in our work, where you could just, not build to like a end, but build to something that kind of builds on itself.
Well, maybe if Anna can share her brick connection, we can just keep on restacking bricks forever and ever.
Exactly.
And make a million buildings.
Yeah, that's it. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Reshuffling, reusing the same bricks for 20 years.
Yes. Yeah.
So I was wondering, where did 23,000 name came from?
Yes. So as Pablo kind of outlined, Maria and I met in Basel, and then we moved back to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we were living in this house at 23 Calvin Street, which is when we started working together. And we took the name from the address, and we thought it's an interesting way to name an architecture practice, because it's sort of the name of a building, right? The address is kind of the name of a building. And for us, we do think about spaces, as having a character, a formative character. So it's I think fitting. Yeah, we also just liked how it sounded, 23C, 23 Kelvin.
I like the fact that it's sort of anonymous, meaning like
Yeah.
people that we collaborate with or people that we work with. It's not that they're just collaborating with the two of us, but with maybe, you know, I don't know, just other collaborators, like that there's a larger group and it's not just the two of us.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe we're all 23 Kelvin.
Maybe your group has 23 people.
Mm.
No,
Not yet.
not yet.
Not yet.
We might hire someone named Calvin though.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is interesting.
So
Yeah.
it's just two of you right now in the firm.
We
Or
have,
there's
we
one-
collaborate with like individuals sometimes, yeah.
I see.
Mhm.
But mainly just the two of us.
Did you have like any key lessons what you learned since you had opened your own practice?
Yes, many, and I don't think we have time for all of them. We can go on and on, I'm sure, between
One
some of
biggest
us, but biggest one. Well, there are just so many sort of spheres of conversation that intersect at an architecture practice, and some of them are disciplinary, like the ones we were talking about today, like creative ways of working and ways of thinking and preoccupations and ideas. Some of them are pragmatic, like running a business and finding time and managing people and personalities. But I think one that carries through all of them is that to be a good designer, or to run a good business for that matter, or to be a good practitioner of architecture, in my opinion, I think you really need to be a good listener and a good observer of people. And I think you need to find a way to relate to as many different types of people and places and as you can, like be very open if you can be, and find ways of connection to people, because ultimately architecture is just a series of disciplinary connections, person to person, right? Like me to another architect, me to a structural engineer, me to a client, me to a contractor, me to you guys. You know, it's all just people talking to each other, and every single time it's just a conversation in the end. So being able to understand where people are coming from, thinking through their value systems, not always sort of imposing yourself on every situation, but rather finding space, making space for everyone else to come to the table and collaborate with you. I think these are all sort of basic kindergarten principles, right? Like things we all learn as children, but somehow they get lost in the mess of all of this stuff that we do all the time. And I think that's really, if I can say one thing, that is the thing. Like that is really it. Just be a caring, sensitive, open person in the world, and your practice will benefit from it.
Thank you. And Anna, I have a similar question to you. What advice would you give to us, like the young experiencing architects coming out from school, to be like you, to have your own practice?
What advice? I mean, I guess it's I guess, I mean, there are many things, no, I think I could say. One thing that might, or that at least helps me, or that I need in a way, is to always try to look for motivation and what actually brings being in constant search of motivation, because what can happen is that you can, like, when you start working and things maybe are not going that well, or not as how you expected, you can start questioning many things about what you're doing, and always like trying to find this motivation. And it can be just like find sources of inspiration in different type of art forms and or doing things that you enjoy doing. That is, I think, well, that's something that we should all constantly do, no? Before you get to a point where those doubts that you're having are just like way bigger than how they started. So yeah, always try to keep your thoughts fresh and try to do things that you like and try to draw inspiration from whatever you like.
Thank you very much for the answer. Sorry, it was like a very
I wanted to interject if I can, because I think it's a great question and it's difficult to answer, but I can use it to kind of maybe do a final comment and then we can let our guests go who are very generously staying with us. Especially Anna is like 1 a.m. I think in Europe. So but it's funny because we actually, Juan and Laura and I, we tried to we made an attempt to answer that question recently, and we're also engaged in teaching, obviously, as some of you know, and we kind of thought of our friends that are here presenting today, Maria and Matt, and like one slide that I've seen them share, or I don't know where I've seen it, that this kind of idea of keeping it simple as a value, and I think we saw it today, in the work of both, and that is an extremely difficult and fundamental and skill to train as a practitioner, which I think also kind of connects with this idea of intuition that Anna was talking about. And it's funny because it didn't come up in this lecture series until today, but I think it's kind of inherently part of our generation that we're also finding ways to keeping it simple. Sometimes because we have to, right? Because of the many constraints that our projects face. So for me, that is a perfect answer, kind of that through the work of both practices today, right? But also another idea that I wanted to share is, this idea of also kind of archiving or appropriating that we've seen in the work of both of you, and that we constantly all do, right? As kind of like finding and observing and looking for things and then adding our own layer to it, right? And again, I think that's another, another quality, I think a really good positive quality of our generation, right? That we're not worried about kind of constant creation or genuine invention, but that we kind of observe what there is around us and try to kind of layer or see them through our own lens. And yeah, I guess that's my comment. I have no question, but I found both lectures incredibly fascinating. I know your work and I admire it, but like Laura was saying, to kind of hear you talking about it is super refreshing.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, guys. It's super fun. And Anna, thank you. Go to sleep now.
Yes. Don't worry. Don't worry.
It's Carolina for moderating.
Yeah, thank you, Carolina. We'll catch you soon.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
very much.